There's a strange kind of comfort that comes with sitting down at a computer and opening the internet. When we lock our doors and scroll through our phones or log into our favorite platforms, it feels like we're entering a controlled environment. Profiles have usernames. Accounts have profile pictures. Platforms have moderators, rules, and systems that are supposed to keep things safe. Over time, people have come to trust this system. Apps like Discord, Instagram, Telegram, and countless others are used every day for normal things: talking to friends, gaming, sharing photos, or joining communities. Most people assume the worst parts of the internet exist somewhere far away, hidden deep in the dark web, separated from the platforms millions of people use every day. But that sense of safety can be misleading. In the past few years, investigators and cybercrime researchers have identified something very different emerging online: a network that doesn't focus on stealing credit cards, hacking accounts, or committing traditional cybercrime. Instead, its goal is far more disturbing. It focuses on manipulating people, breaking them down psychologically, and pushing vulnerable individuals toward increasingly dangerous behavior. This network doesn't operate like a traditional organization. It has no headquarters, no official leader, and no single platform where it exists. Instead, it spreads across multiple apps and private servers, constantly rebuilding itself whenever one part of it disappears. Members refer to it by different names in different spaces, but the name most investigators recognize is 764. Unlike many internet groups that exist only online, the activities connected to 764 have repeatedly crossed into the real world. Authorities in several countries have linked the network to cases involving exploitation, manipulation, harassment, and situations that ended in tragedy. What makes the story even more unsettling is where it started, because the person who created the group wasn't an experienced criminal or an adult mastermind. He was a teenager. His name was Bradley Cadenhead. Online, he used the name Felix. Cadenhead grew up in Stephenville, Texas, a small-town environment where, to most people around him, life appeared fairly ordinary. Like many teenagers, he spent large amounts of time online. But over the years, his internet activity gradually moved into darker areas. According to reports and psychological evaluations later referenced in court documents, his exposure to disturbing content began very early. At first, it started with typical adult material that many children unfortunately encounter online. But over time, that exposure escalated. Instead of backing away from disturbing material, Cadenhead reportedly began seeking it out. Videos and images showing graphic events or real-world violence became something he consumed regularly. Investigators later suggested that this constant exposure may have desensitized him over time. By the time he reached his early teens, those images no longer seemed to provoke a strong emotional response. Around the same time, troubling behavior began appearing offline as well. At 13 years old, Cadenhead was placed on juvenile probation after making threats about a potential attack at his school. Reports from that period describe ongoing behavioral problems, including aggressive outbursts and refusal to participate in counseling programs designed to help him. Attempts by authorities and family members to intervene appeared to have little effect. According to records from that time, his situation continued to deteriorate. At one point, he was hospitalized after taking a large amount of over-the-counter medication during what appeared to be a mental health crisis. As his real-world life became increasingly unstable, the internet filled more and more of his time. Eventually, that path led him to a platform that would become central to the story: Discord. Like many users, Cadenhead joined servers dedicated to gaming and online communities, but one server he encountered stood out. The server was called CVLT, or Cult. Investigators later described CVLT as a space where manipulation tactics were openly practiced and discussed. Members reportedly shared strategies for identifying vulnerable individuals online and gradually gaining control over them. In those servers, experienced users demonstrated methods of building trust with targets, often people who were already dealing with loneliness, mental health struggles, or difficult home situations. The process usually followed a predictable pattern. A member would begin by acting supportive and friendly. They would slowly isolate the person from others in the server, and eventually they would begin requesting increasingly personal information or private images. Once that material was obtained, it could be used as leverage. According to investigators, Caden had spent time observing how these interactions worked. Over time, he began applying those same methods himself. Eventually, he decided he no longer wanted to remain a member of someone else's group. He wanted to create his own. In late 2020, he started building a new Discord server. For the name, he chose a number connected to his hometown, 764. The number itself came from a prefix connected to the zip code in Stephenville. On its own, the number meant almost nothing, but inside the new server, it quickly became something else entirely. Using multiple accounts under the name Felix, Cadenhead began recruiting users and spreading invitations to private servers. His accounts were banned repeatedly by different platforms. Discord banned him. Other platforms banned him. But each time it happened, he simply created another account and returned. According to people who interacted with him online, he claimed to have created hundreds of accounts over time. The constant bans didn't stop him. In fact, they seemed to encourage him. Investigators later said that control, not money or fame, appeared to be the main motivation. The group that began forming around him followed the same tactics he had learned earlier. Members searched online communities for vulnerable individuals. They started conversations, built trust, then gradually escalated their demands. What began as a small server slowly turned into a growing network. But at this stage, it was still just a group of manipulative users online. That would soon change, because the next step in the evolution of 764 wasn't just about tactics, it was about ideology. And once that ideology took hold, the group would begin transforming into something far more dangerous. The ideology and structure of 764. At first, 764 looked like just another toxic internet group. Online communities have always had trolls, people trying to shock others, push boundaries, or gain attention by acting cruel. But investigators say that 764 eventually became something very different. Most predatory online groups are driven by money. Some try to steal identities. Others try to scam victims. But 764 gradually evolved into something more ideological. Members began adopting ideas from extremist movements that had existed for decades, particularly a controversial occult organization known as the Order of Nine Angles, often abbreviated as O9A. To understand how 764 changed, you have to understand the ideas that influenced it. The Order of Nine Angles originated in the United Kingdom in the late 20th century and is widely considered one of the most extreme occult movements connected to far-right ideology. The group promotes a worldview built around chaos, anti-social behavior, and the rejection of conventional morality. In their writings, empathy is described as a weakness. Compassion is framed as something that holds humanity back. Followers are encouraged to test their limits by committing what they call sinister acts. The goal, according to the ideology, is to break away from normal human morality and evolve into something stronger. Most people who encounter these writings dismiss them as fringe extremism, but in certain corners of the internet, those ideas found an audience. Members of 764 began referencing these concepts inside their servers, mixing them with internet culture and the tactics they were already using to manipulate victims. One concept that became particularly important was something the ideology referred to as culling. In traditional O9A texts, culling refers to eliminating people considered weak or unnecessary in order to strengthen society. However, in the online communities connected to 764, the idea was interpreted in a different way. Instead of physical elimination, members often framed it as the psychological destruction of a person's life. Victims were no longer seen as individuals. They were labeled with dismissive terms like mundanes or ops. Inside these communities, harming someone's mental stability, reputation, or personal life was sometimes framed as a kind of achievement, proof that someone had advanced within the group. This ideology gave the network something it didn't have before, a sense of purpose. Instead of seeing themselves as internet trolls, members began viewing their actions as part of a larger mission, a kind of digital war against society. And once that mindset took hold, the network began expanding rapidly. One of the most confusing aspects of 764 for investigators was its structure. Unlike traditional criminal organizations, it didn't operate with a single leader controlling everything. Instead, it functioned more like a network of smaller communities, often referred to internally as comms. Each comm was essentially a separate server or group chat. Some focused on recruitment, others specialized in harassment or extortion. Some were built specifically for sharing disturbing material. When one server was shut down, members simply created another. That made the network extremely difficult to dismantle. Investigators often described the system as similar to a hydra, a creature from mythology, where cutting off one head only causes more to grow in its place. Under the broader umbrella of 764, multiple offshoot communities began appearing online. Each one developed its own focus. One example was Sleeptown, a group that reportedly centered around coercing victims into harming themselves on camera. Another was Harm Nation, which had similar activities and focused heavily on humiliating victims. Then there was Leak Society, a community dedicated to doxing and distributing private information. Members used it to release personal photos, addresses, and identifying details of victims who refused to comply with their demands. Another offshoot, MKY, sometimes called Maniac Murder Cult, had ties to extremist ideology and pushed members toward acts of real-world violence as a way of proving loyalty. There were also groups connected to digital harassment and threats such as XVN, where members were linked to large-scale hoaxes like bomb threats or emergency calls intended to cause chaos. These groups didn't always operate together, but they shared a similar culture and language. And most importantly, they shared the same methods. Inside many of these communities, there was also a clear hierarchy. At the top were the admins, the people who controlled the servers and decided who was allowed inside. Below them were recruiters, sometimes called boosters. These members were responsible for finding new targets and bringing them into private spaces. At the bottom were the people referred to as slaves. These were often individuals who had originally been victims. After being manipulated for long enough, some were convinced that the only way to escape the pressure was to help recruit someone else. That created a cycle that allowed the network to sustain itself. The abused became the recruiters, and the process repeated again and again. Status inside the network was also tied to something investigators later referred to as trophy folders. These were collections of files stored online, usually videos, screenshots, or recordings that documented the actions members had pressured victims to perform. The more disturbing the material was, the higher the status it could bring. Members seeking promotion within a server were sometimes required to submit their best work to admins for review. If it impressed the group, they could gain access to more private channels or higher-level servers. This competitive environment created a dangerous dynamic. Each person felt pressure to escalate further than the last. If one member convinced a victim to do something humiliating, another would try to push someone even further. Over time, investigators say this race for attention caused the behavior inside these communities to become increasingly extreme, and eventually it pushed some members to attempt acts that went far beyond the internet. That's when law enforcement agencies around the world started paying attention, because the consequences were no longer staying online. If Bradley Cadenhead, known online as Felix, was the person who started 764, Another figure soon became one of the most notorious members connected to the network. His name was Joseph Schoonover. Online, he was known by several aliases, but the name most people associated with him was Courtbox, often shortened simply to Court. Schoonover's path into the darker parts of the internet did not begin in the same environments as many others tied to 764. Instead, he originally spent time in much more ordinary online communities. One of those communities was a website called Flippanim, a platform where users created and shared simple stick figure animations. To many people there, Schoonover appeared to be just another creative teenager experimenting with animation and internet humor. But according to people who knew him from that platform, he also experienced frequent harassment from other users. Rather than leaving the platform or stepping away from those communities, Schoonover began searching for spaces where he could gain influence and control. Eventually, that search led him into the same online circles surrounding 764. There, he discovered a culture that rewarded intimidation, manipulation, and dominance over others, and instead of simply participating, he quickly began adapting those tactics for himself. Over time, Schoonover separated from the main group and created his own offshoot community. The group became known as Cascar. While other 764-related communities focused on ideology or digital harassment, Cascar developed a reputation for something different: psychological control. The goal inside these servers wasn't just to embarrass victims. It was to completely break their sense of independence. Members targeted individuals who were already emotionally vulnerable, often teenagers dealing with isolation or personal struggles. Once a victim was identified, the process followed the familiar pattern used across the network. First came friendship, then isolation, then pressure. Victims were pushed further and further into humiliating situations designed to demonstrate obedience to the group. Investigators say the material produced in these interactions was sometimes used as proof of loyalty inside the community. Instead of keeping it private, members would share screenshots or recordings to show their influence over someone else. In that environment, cruelty became a way to earn. One of the most unusual aspects of communities like this is how unstable they are. People who gain power inside them often become targets themselves later. That's exactly what happened to Schoonover. At one point, personal information about him began circulating online, something commonly referred to as doxing. Old accounts, personal photos, and details about his life began spreading across the same communities he had once participated in. Even his family became part of the harassment. According to reports, after his mother passed away, individuals connected to those communities found her obituary online and flooded the comment section with disturbing images and messages. It was a stark example of how these networks eventually turn against almost everyone involved. Schoonover was later arrested in connection with his activities, but by the time that happened, the tactics associated with Cascar had already spread throughout the broader network. Around the same time that Cascar was gaining attention, another branch of the network was experimenting with a different idea. Instead of targeting victims randomly, some members began offering their services to outsiders. In other words, harassment became a product. One of the people associated with this shift was Vincent Collison, who used the online alias Yuki. Collison reportedly operated a group sometimes referred to as Brick Squad. The concept was simple. People outside the network could contact members and request that someone be targeted. Payments were usually made through cryptocurrency. According to investigators, the services offered ranged from online harassment campaigns to real-world intimidation. Some of the activities included swatting, where false emergency calls are made to send police to someone's home. Others involved organizing coordinated harassment campaigns designed to overwhelm a victim with threats or humiliation. More extreme cases reportedly involved recruiting individuals in the same geographic area as the victim to carry out acts of vandalism. These operations often relied on younger recruits who were manipulated or promised rewards. Members would sometimes record the incidents and send the footage back as proof that the job had been completed. Inside the community, those recordings were sometimes treated as achievements. Investigators later recovered chat logs showing members discussing these incidents and sharing news articles about them. For law enforcement agencies tracking the group, this shift was alarming. The network was no longer limited to online manipulation. It was beginning to influence real-world events. Eventually, Collison's own online activity helped investigators identify him. After tracing digital evidence linked to his accounts, authorities were able to locate his residence. When law enforcement searched the property, they reportedly discovered large collections of files containing personal information about potential targets. Although arrests slowed some operations, the concept of harassment for hire had already spread to other parts of the network. Once again, removing one individual didn't eliminate the system. Another group simply adopted the same model. By this point, investigators were starting to notice a pattern. Each stage in the evolution of the network pushed behavior further. First, it was online manipulation, then public humiliation, then organized harassment. And in some corners of the network, members began pushing toward something even more extreme. Real-world acts intended to prove loyalty to the ideology they had adopted. Those cases would soon bring international attention to the network, and one of the most tragic examples involved a young man named Samuel Hervey. The Samuel Hervey case and the spread into real-world violence. Within the culture of 764 and its connected communities, there was a term that appeared frequently in chat logs and discussions. The term was an hero. It was a phrase that originally came from early internet slang used to reference someone ending their own life. Over time, in darker corners of online culture, the phrase became twisted into something else, a spectacle. Instead of being treated as a tragedy, it was sometimes framed as a kind of performance. Investigators say this mindset played a role in one of the most disturbing incidents connected to these communities. The case involved a man named Samuel Hervey. Samuel was a 25-year-old biochemistry student from Minnesota. Friends and family later described him as intelligent and curious, but also someone who struggled with serious mental health challenges. He had been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, a condition that can combine mood disturbances with symptoms similar to schizophrenia. During the isolation and stress of the COVID-19 pandemic, his condition reportedly worsened. At some point, he stopped taking his prescribed medication and began traveling abroad. Eventually, he arrived in Kyrgyzstan, staying in hostels in the capital city of Bishkek. He was far from home, struggling emotionally and increasingly isolated. Like many people experiencing that kind of isolation, he turned to the internet for connection. Samuel created a Discord server and named it An Hero Tempest. Inside the server, he spoke openly about the way he was feeling and about his thoughts regarding ending his life. Some people in the server attempted to offer support and encourage him to seek help, but investigators later said that the server was eventually discovered by individuals connected to the same online communities surrounding 764. Among them was a teenage user who went by the username FMLK. According to chat logs later reviewed by investigators, this user and others did not attempt to stop Samuel. Instead, they began encouraging him. They framed his suffering as something meaningful, something that could become memorable. Over time, they convinced him that documenting what he was planning would make his story live forever online. For weeks, conversations continued between Samuel and the people in the server. Eventually, a location was chosen, a mountain pilgrimage site known as Tashtar Ata, outside the city. On November 7, 2021, Samuel traveled there. He placed his phone on a tripod and began broadcasting a live stream through Discord. In a private voice call connected to the stream, 29 users were present. According to the logs, some people remained silent while watching. Others posted slogans and comments connected to extremist communities. When the live stream ended, the people watching did not respond with grief or concern. Instead, the recording was saved and circulated through other communities as proof of the event. Investigators say the footage later became part of what some users referred to as a trophy archive. For the people responsible, the incident was treated as a success. For everyone else, it was a warning about how far manipulation inside these communities could go. Around the same time, another branch of the network was moving in an even more dangerous direction. One of the most extreme offshoots was known as MKY, sometimes referred to as the Maniac Murder Cult. While many 764-related communities focused on digital manipulation, MKY promoted the idea that true commitment required real-world actions. Members discussed extremist ideology and encouraged one another to prove loyalty through violent acts. For investigators, the existence of MKY showed that the ideology spreading through these spaces had begun crossing from online behavior into physical attacks. One of the most widely reported cases connected to MKY involved a young man named Nino Luciano. Luciano was born in Germany in 2004 and spent much of his childhood moving through foster care and psychiatric treatment programs. His early life was unstable, and he often struggled with isolation. That combination of loneliness and anger made him a typical target for recruitment into extremist communities online. When Luciano turned 18 and aged out of state support systems, he began spending more time in online forums connected to the MKY ideology. Members inside those communities pressured him to prove himself. They mocked him, calling him weak and accusing him of pretending to support their beliefs without taking action. Over time, the pressure intensified. Eventually, Luciano decided to prove them wrong. On April 12, 2022, Luciano walked through the town of Mediaș, Romania, carrying a knife and his phone. According to investigators, he was also connected to a live online call with members of the MKY community. He approached a 74-year-old woman who was outside near her home. Moments later, he attacked her. Authorities later reported that the attack was broadcast online to the people watching. Luciano fled the area shortly afterward, but within days, investigators were able to trace his digital activity and identify him. He was arrested and later questioned by police. During the investigation, Luciano reportedly described the attack using the same terminology commonly used in 764-related communities. He framed it as a form of ideological action. In court, he was ultimately sentenced to 14 years in a psychiatric detention facility, where he would receive treatment while serving his sentence. For the communities connected to MKY, however, the event did not have the effect investigators hoped. Instead of discouraging similar behavior, the recording of the attack circulated online and was sometimes treated as propaganda. Once again, the same disturbing pattern appeared. Real-world tragedy became content, and content became recruitment. By this point, law enforcement agencies across multiple countries had begun noticing the same names, the same language, and the same tactics appearing in different cases. Servers linked to 764 and its offshoots were appearing across North America, Europe, South America, and the Middle East. Victims were located in dozens of different countries. The network had grown far beyond the small group that Bradley Cadenhead had originally started in Texas. Investigators were now dealing with something far larger, and that realization would soon trigger one of the largest international investigations into an online extremist network. Investigations, arrests, and the ongoing threat. For a long time, many people believed communities like 764 were simply groups of troubled teenagers acting out online. But as investigators began examining the network more closely, they discovered something far more complicated. Behind many of the servers were adult participants. Some of them weren't just observers. They were helping build the infrastructure that allowed the network to operate. These individuals provided encrypted storage, managed the distribution of files, and sometimes stepped in to intimidate victims directly. Law enforcement officials began referring to these figures as vultures, Unlike the younger members who were often driven by attention or influence within the group, these adults had a different motivation. They saw the network as an opportunity to exploit victims while hiding behind layers of younger intermediaries. One of the cases that brought this reality into focus involved a man named Richard Densmore. Densmore was a 47-year-old veteran from Michigan who allegedly operated a server connected to the network. Online, he used the alias Rabid. Investigators say his role was different from the younger members who carried out recruitment. Instead of searching for victims himself, Densmore reportedly acted as a manager. When younger users pressured someone into sharing private material, Densmore would step in to handle the intimidation. According to investigators, he would use his adult voice and authority to frighten victims. In some conversations, he allegedly told victims that he had connections with law enforcement and that resisting the group would only make their situation worse. When authorities eventually searched his residence, they reportedly discovered a large digital archive containing thousands of files connected to the network. Many of those files, investigators said, appeared to have been produced specifically for distribution within those. Another arrest connected to the network involved William John Scott Tolko Jr., a 34-year-old man from Florida. Online, he used the name ITS666. Unlike some others in the network, Tolko presented himself online as someone promoting traditional values and anti-modern beliefs. But investigators later alleged that he played a key role in distributing extremist material and recruiting younger members. Tolko reportedly acted as a translator of ideology. He would take writings from extremist sources and convert them into simplified language, memes, and messages that were easier for younger users to understand. In that way, he helped spread the ideology that had begun shaping the culture of the network. His arrest reinforced what investigators were beginning to realize. 764 was not just a group of teenagers misbehaving online. It was becoming a multi-layered network involving both minors and adults. By late 2022, the number of incidents connected to the network had become impossible for authorities to ignore. Investigators had documented cases linked to harassment campaigns, exploitation, real-world violence, and multiple deaths associated with events surrounding the community. At that point, the FBI and the U.S. Department of Justice officially classified Group 764 and its related networks as a Tier 1 domestic terrorism threat. That designation dramatically changed how investigators could approach the case. Instead of treating the issue as scattered internet crimes, authorities could now use counterterrorism tools and intelligence resources to track the network. The investigation was given a code name, Operation Global Shadow. The biggest challenge investigators faced was the decentralized nature of the group. There was no headquarters, no central leader. Servers appeared and disappeared constantly. So instead of targeting a single organization, investigators began studying the patterns shared across the network. They analyzed the language members used, the emojis, the slogans, the symbols, even the way members greeted each other in chats. Using this information, investigators were able to map connections between different servers and identify key individuals involved in the network. Working alongside technology companies, law enforcement agencies coordinated one of the largest server takedowns connected to the group. In a single operation, more than 130 Discord servers linked to the network were shut down. But instead of simply deleting them, investigators captured the data first. Every message, every user ID, every file stored in the servers. Those records became critical evidence for future prosecutions. One of the most significant cases involved the network's original founder. Bradley Cadenhead, the teenager who had created 764 under the alias Felix, was arrested and eventually pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges related to illegal material involving minors. In federal court, prosecutors argued that his actions had directly contributed to the exploitation and psychological destruction of numerous victims. The judge ultimately sentenced him to 80 years in federal prison. Another high-profile case involved Caleb Merritt, who had used the network to groom a 12-year-old girl and later traveled across state lines to abduct her. Merritt received an extremely severe sentence of 350 years in prison, one of the longest punishments connected to the network. Authorities described the sentence as a strong warning to others involved in the community. Despite these major arrests, investigators soon realized something troubling. The network didn't disappear. When servers were removed in the United States, new ones began appearing elsewhere. Activity shifted toward Eastern Europe, South America, and parts of the Middle East. New offshoot groups began forming, often using slightly different names, but following the same tactics. By 2025, researchers tracking the network noticed another shift. Some members were encouraging acts of random real-world violence as a way to prove loyalty to the ideology. These attacks were not politically motivated. They were meant to demonstrate that the person carrying them out had fully rejected empathy and social norms. Several incidents investigated by authorities were linked to individuals who had participated in 764 related communities before committing attacks. As the original network fragmented, new groups appeared. One of the most prominent was a network sometimes referred to as 8884. In December 2025, a 19-year-old named Alexis Alder Chavez, known online as Zach8884, pleaded guilty to charges connected to racketeering and child exploitation in San Antonio, Texas. Investigators said he had been leading a cell that promoted an ideology known as accelerationism, the belief that society should be pushed toward collapse through chaos. Another group, known as Hill, claimed responsibility for several vehicle arson incidents across parts of the Midwest. Videos of the fires were edited into propaganda clips and spread across social media to attract new recruits. By the end of 2025, the scale of the investigation had grown dramatically. Authorities reported that 191 individuals connected to the network had been arrested in 28 different countries. In December of that year, Canada became the first country to formally designate the 764 extremist network as a terrorist entity. That designation allowed authorities to seize assets, prosecute individuals, providing support, and treat the network as a coordinated extremist threat rather than just a group of internet criminals. Even with these efforts, the structure of the network continued to evolve. Members began moving their data to decentralized storage systems and using encrypted communication platforms that were much harder for investigators to monitor. The story of 764 represents a disturbing reality about the modern internet. A single teenager sitting in a bedroom in Texas was able to create something that spread across continents. Communities built around manipulation and cruelty were able to grow inside platforms used every day by millions of people, and in many cases, the victims were individuals who were already vulnerable and simply searching for connection online. By 2025, the FBI reported that tips connected to violent extremist online communities had increased by more than 200%. The people behind these networks are not hiding in some distant corner of the dark web. Many of them operate in the same apps used for gaming, messaging, and social media. The ultimate goal of communities like 764 isn't just crime. It's desensitization, turning violence into content, turning suffering into currency, and slowly breaking down the social boundaries that normally protect people from harming each other. As we move forward, the challenge isn't only for law enforcement. It's also for parents, technology companies, educators, and communities. Because the battle against networks like this isn't only about shutting down servers, it's about understanding how they grow and preventing the next generation from being pulled into them. The internet has given humanity incredible tools for communication and connection, but stories like this are a reminder that those same tools can also be used in dangerous ways. The darkness is still out there, but awareness is the first step in confronting it.